You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, DNA ID, Malice, All Things Crime, and Riddle Me That. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking. With the backdrop of the Independence Day celebrations in full swing, 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin would leave her home at 1300 Virginia Street at around 11:40 p.m. in her brown 1963 Corvair to pick up her friend, 19-year-old Michael Mageau, at Beechwood Avenue in Vallejo. Darlene, a popular waitress at Terry's restaurant, was a mother to a young daughter and was married to Dean Ferrin, who was working the night of July 4th. Michael was the son of a local exterminator and had a twin brother. It was no secret that he had romantic feelings for Darlene. The pair was supposed to go out and pick up fireworks to celebrate, but some have insinuated that they were actually going to buy drugs. Either way, they changed their plans and decided to go to Mr. Ed's restaurant, a local hangout, but they didn't stay there long and departed for Blue Rock Springs Park, situated on the eastern fringes of Vallejo. They headed north on Columbus Parkway before entering the parking lot close to the golf course. They had been there just a brief time when some young teenagers entered the parking lot and set off some firecrackers before quickly leaving. Just a couple minutes later, a vehicle entered the parking lot and positioned itself only 6 to 8 feet from the left of Darlene Ferrin's Corvair, extinguishing its headlights before sparking them back into life and pulling away. Michael Mageau estimated that about 5 minutes later, either the same vehicle or a different one entered the Blue Rock Springs parking lot and pulled up behind their vehicle, approximately 10 feet away. A man, who Mageau suspected to be a policeman armed with a weapon and a flashlight, left his vehicle and approached the passenger side of the Corvair, where Mageau was seated. Without uttering a word, the man unleashed a volley of 5 shots, striking Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau several times. In blind panic and fear, Michael propelled himself into the rear of the vehicle in order to seek refuge from the merciless assault. The assailant retreated to his car, but after Mageau yelled out in pain, the gunman, probably realizing that his victims were alive, returned and fired 2 more shots into each victim. In total, the assailant fired 9 shots from his weapon at close to midnight. Michael Mageau was struck 4 times, whereas Darlene Ferrin received 9 entry wounds and 7 exit wounds, despite only being struck directly 5 times. Some of the shots carried enough velocity that they passed through Michael Mageau's body into Darlene Ferrin. The attacker then drove away, heading in the direction of Springs Road. This was another brutal assault on a young couple enjoying themselves in Vallejo. But this was only the beginning of the story.
Approximately 40 minutes later, at 12:40 a.m., an unknown male placed a payphone call from the Springs Road and Tuolumne Street intersection to the Vallejo Police Department at 111 Amador Street. 26-year-old Nancy Slover, a police dispatcher, would hear the unnerving message of, "I want to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find the kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." The individual was effectively claiming responsibility for the attack at Blue Rock Springs Park and the double murder at Lake Herman Road on December the 20th, 1968. At this juncture, the aftermath of the attack at Blue Rock Springs had already been discovered by police, which included officers Richard Hoffman, who was first on the scene, and Ed Rust, who arrived a little time later. Shortly after the shooting, at approximately 12:03 a.m., 3 young people in a vehicle passing the Blue Rock Springs parking lot discovered the stricken Michael Mageau by the right side of the Corvair, having extricated himself from the vehicle. They raced off to 938 Castlewood Drive in Vallejo and alerted the police at about 12:10 a.m. Michael Mageau would fortunately survive his terrible injuries, but sadly Darlene Ferrin would be pronounced dead at 12:38 a.m. upon her arrival at Kaiser Hospital. Responding law enforcement to the parking lot would discover 7 shell casings by the right side of the Corvair, with 2 expended casings found on the rear floorboard of the vehicle, suggestive of a killer who had leaned into the vehicle to fire off the final 2 shots at Michael Mageau.
Michael Mageau, after life-saving surgery, was able to give a description of the killer, who he described as a heavy-set man, standing at about 5 foot 8 inches tall, with a beefy build, but not blubbery fat. He thought he might be possibly 195 to 200 pounds, and he had short curly hair. It was light brown, almost blonde. He added that the man was not wearing glasses, but one thing that he stressed was his assailant had a particularly large face. Michael's description of the killer had been widely questioned due to the limited time he observed the perpetrator, coupled with the fact he had a flashlight pointed at his face and only glimpsed a side profile of the attacker. This has to be considered when comparing the description to later eyewitness recollections. The payphone call by the killer just 40 minutes after the double shooting was unusual, but nothing compared to 3 nearly identical letters mailed to the Vallejo Times-Herald, San Francisco Chronicle, and San Francisco Examiner just 27 days later. In these letters, the writer claimed that he was responsible for the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen on December 20th, 1968, and that he was also responsible for the attack at Blue Rock Springs. The author provided details of the crimes only known to him and the police. Each letter contained 1/3 of a cryptogram, and the author promised that if each segment of the cryptogram was put together and the cipher solved, it would lead to the writer's identity. The 3 portions of cryptogram, when combined, became widely known as the 408 cipher. The author of the letters stated, quote, "I want you to print this cipher on the front page of your paper. In this cipher is my identity. If you do not print this cipher by the afternoon of Friday, 1st of August, 1969, I will go on a kill rampage Friday night. I will cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, and then move on to kill again, until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend." The portions of cipher were published in area newspapers, and his threats of more murder never materialized, despite the fact that all of the newspapers did not give him the front page coverage he requested. The 408 cipher was solved on August 8, 1969, by a couple from Salinas, California, named Donald Gene Hardin and his wife Betty, and unsurprisingly, the cipher didn't reveal the killer's identity. The solved cipher read as follows: "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all that I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." 18 characters were left over and unused in the cipher, and most experts believe it was just filler to make the cipher have a cleaner appearance.
Despite the author of the 3 letters providing details only known to him and the police, it appeared that Vallejo Police Chief Jack Stilts was less than convinced, urging the letter writer to provide more information about each crime. The writer duly obliged on August 4th, 1969, likely hand-delivering a communication to the San Francisco Examiner with the paragraph of, "In answer to your asking for more details about the good times I have had in Vallejo, I shall be very happy to supply even more material. By the way, are the police having a good time with the code? If not, tell them to cheer up. When they do crack it, they will have me." But above this paragraph, the killer had ascribed himself an ominous pseudonym. He began the correspondence with This is the Zodiac speaking, an introduction he was not going to let us forget.
There is one curious thing about the events of July 4th and 5th of 1969, Rich, and that the killer made the payphone call to Nancy Slover 40 minutes after the attack at Blue Rock Springs Park, despite the payphone at the intersection of Springs and Tuolumne being only 10 minutes from the crime scene, therefore begging the question of what the killer did with the time between fleeing Blue Rock Springs Park and making the call. This has been known as the lost 40 minutes. I personally think that it's possible that Zodiac lived close to that phone booth on Springs and Tuolumne. He may have went home after the shooting, stashed his gun and perhaps his car, and then walked to the phone booth. With no car, he was less likely to be noticed, and if he was approached by police, he'd have no weapons on him. A killer who lived in Richmond, Oakland, Napa, or San Francisco could easily have made this phone call on their way back home while heading from the crime scene to their residence. Yet this killer traveled just 3.7 miles in 40 minutes, thereby opening up the possibility it was a safer option to ditch his weapon, clothes, and vehicle before making the phone call to police dispatcher Nancy Slover. This drives to the heart of the issue, of whether the murderer was a native of Vallejo.
The attacker at Blue Rock Springs may have made a crucial mistake when returning to the Corvair to fire off the final 4 shots at the young couple. 2 expended casings were discovered on the rear floorboard of the Corvair, indicating that the killer had leaned into the vehicle over the front passenger seat to take aim at Michael Mageau, a passenger seat that a bloody Michael Mageau propelled himself over to escape the barrage of gunfire. Notwithstanding the fact there was a likelihood for blood spatter resulting from the shooting of both victims to also land on the passenger seat. If the killer had leaned over that seat, then there is a distinct possibility he received blood transfer to the front of his shirt, described as blue in colour by Michael Mageau. If this were the case, it would have been a wise move for the killer to change his plans and make the phone call after he had travelled home and changed clothes. Many people believe that the Zodiac killer was not a native of Vallejo because they claim he got his payphone directions to the crime scene so horribly wrong. However, the context of the message changes dramatically when we insert just one full stop between the words east and on. It now reads, "I want to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east. On Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find the kids in a brown car." A vehicle leaving the Vallejo police station via Solano Avenue and entering Springs Road would have to travel 1.39 miles due east along Spring Road to reach Columbus Parkway, in accordance with the payphone message of 1 mile east.
The debut of the Zodiac letter also offered up a convenient eyewitness to the payphone call, not mentioned in any police report. The author wrote, quote, "The man who told police that my car was brown was a Negro, about 40 to 45, rather shabbily dressed. I was in this phone booth having some fun with the Vallejo cop when he was walking by. When I hung the phone up, the damn thing began to ring, and that drew his attention to me and my car. This eyewitness has never been traced or identified as being real." The Zodiac could have described the man as a Negro 40 to 45 years of age and shabbily dressed, so as to authenticate this eyewitness as a credible source, who happened to observe me in my car when the phone rang. There was never any need to attach my car to the end of this phrase, unless the Zodiac killer was trying to sell the notion he was still in his vehicle at this point and could drive anywhere. If this eyewitness was conjured up by the Zodiac, then the real possibility exists that he walked to this payphone to make this call in the early hours of July 5th, 1969.
There is one more important factor to consider when we ruminate over the possibility of a Zodiac killer who lived in Vallejo, or possibly close to the payphone. One important feature of the Zodiac killer was his propensity to mail communications to the newspapers that may have inadvertently given away the location of his residence. Often when people are questioned by the police over missing persons, They make a mental note of whether the person is describing the missing person in the past or present tense, which is why the trinity of communications on July the 31st, 1969 to the Vallejo Times-Herald, San Francisco Chronicle and San Francisco Examiner are so intriguing, having been written in unison. In his communications to the San Francisco Chronicle and Examiner, he states that the other two parts are being mailed to the Vallejo Times, along with the other newspaper. He uses the present tense. However, in his communication to the Vallejo Times-Herald, he states the other two parts have been mailed to the SF Examiner and the SF Chronicle. In this instance, he uses the past tense. If he lived in Vallejo, when writing to the Vallejo Times-Herald, it's understandable he would refer to any mailing to the Vallejo Times-Herald office location in the present tense, as it's nearby in the here and now. When referring to the San Francisco Chronicle and Examiner, which are 30-plus miles away, he addresses them in the past tense. The Zodiac killer is associating Vallejo in the present tense, but is associating San Francisco in the past tense. This may have been a subconscious slip of the pen by the Zodiac killer, inadvertently revealing he was a native of Vallejo.
Any thoughts that the Zodiac would confine his attacks to the Vallejo and Benicia areas would be dispelled approximately 2.5 months later, when he turned up on the shores of Lake Berryessa in Napa County on September 27, 1969. This time, armed with more than one weapon. The murder of 3 wasn't finished yet.
Jody Loomis, Jessica Baggin, Kelly Ann Prosser, Michelle Martinko, Christy Mirak, Carolyn Rose. Do these names mean anything to you? All these people are murder victims whose cases were cold for decades, until recently. They were solved by investigative genetic genealogy. This new crime-solving tool is rapidly providing us with the names of elusive killers. But each one of these cases is unique and worth exploring. Each episode of the DNA ID podcast will focus on one newly solved case and look at the story behind the headline. Who was the victim? Who was their killer? And why did this tragic crime occur? It's brought to you by AbJack Entertainment, hosted and produced by me, Jessica Betancourt, and co-produced by Mike Morford. Make sure you subscribe to DNA ID today, wherever you listen to podcasts, so you don't miss a single episode.
Well, this is the idea that at Blue Rock Springs, Michael Mageau was targeted first. Now, the reason I bring it up is I'll read something here because I've just pulled it up. It says, the police report stated the handbrake was not secured. The ignition was set to on and the transmission was in first gear. The ignition switch of a Corvair is turned to start when firing up the engine. Once the engine starts, the ignition switch must be released immediately. The ignition switch then returns to the on position. So my point being to start it is that it appears the handbrake wasn't on. It was in first gear and the transmission was on, which suggests to me that Darlene Ferrin may have suspected something was a bit off with this guy approaching, and had started her vehicle and got it in first gear and was preparing to actually leave, which brings forth the idea, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute about the ballistics, of why she may have been targeted first, because in all the other crimes, he blindsided Paul Stein. After he got the couple out the vehicle at Lake Homer Road, David Faraday was killed first, and he got at Lake Berryessa, he got Cecilia Shepard to tie up Brian Hartnell. He was always sort of extinguishing the biggest threat first, but the biggest threat in the case of Blue Rock Springs was Darlene Ferrin, because she could actually drive away and thwart any attack he had. So I'm just wondering what your opinion of that is. My impression, the vehicle was actually on and it was ready to go.
Yeah, and I think that's a valid point, because if he doesn't want these people to get away with driving off and leaving him there trying to chase him down, then the threat could be the driver, because that's the person that can get away. But as you mentioned, Zodiac always seemed to take out the more threatening or the male victim first, so that it would be easier for him to deal with the female victim. That's what we assume that he did. If that's the case, though, that makes sense for him walking up to Mike's side of the car and shooting him first. But if it's the opposite, if he was going to take out the biggest threat, why didn't he walk up to Darlene's side of the car? That's kind of an oddity.
Well, I was thinking maybe he came up to the vehicle intending to attack Michael Mageau first, and maybe he saw her with her hands braced on the steering wheel and was looking like she was about to leave and switched and shot her first. The only reason I say this, because I find it unusual. I don't know if you know more about vehicles than I do, but the fact that the ignition was on, which suggests she'd started the car, because you turn it to start and it goes back to on, and also it was in first gear, which is unusual. And if, like, he'd shot her if she was in first gear and her foot was on the clutch pedal, when she was shot, that would depress, the car would stall, and it went from there. It's just unusual, the state the vehicle was found in. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, and one thing that's important, they went there, they sat, they were talking, they were listening to music. I think there's a couple different settings. I don't know what the cars were like back then, but there's settings on most cars now. You have an auxiliary setting where you can turn the ignition partially forward and it will power your radio and everything else. And then you can actually turn it on fully and just sit there with the car idling. But even so, for it to be in gear, you couldn't have it in gear. You wouldn't be parked, you'd be moving. Even if it's at a low crawl, it would move. So unless there was something blocking it from moving, if there was a curb or something underneath the tire keeping it from going forward, if it was in gear, it should have been moving, even if at a low crawl speed.
Yeah.
So it's possible something was blocking the tire from going forward. And it's not the way you would sit and talk and listen to radio in low gear, unless you sat there the entire time with your foot on the brake. So
you'd have the handbrake on, wouldn't you?
And it's not typical for someone to leave a car in gear with the handbrake on and sit there like that. I wouldn't imagine anyone having a conversation that way. I think they would either put it in park and turn the car all the way off, or turn it on auxiliary, or leave it running, but they wouldn't leave it in gear. That's pretty unusual.
So I've got a picture here, and it's got the ignition switch, and it has lock on the left. Then it's off, on, and start as it goes to the right. And it says here, off turns the engine off and the accessories. The start, used only when starting engine. When released, switch returns to on automatically. And that's the position her vehicle was in, which means it had been started. And this is why I'm thinking maybe the Zodiac took his first shots on her first. But the ballistics also can be argued to back up the notion she was shot first, because if you remember, people were always trying to explain how she had 9 entry wounds and 7 exit wounds with only 9 shots fired. And I think Jan Quasar did a great piece on this, and I did a piece on my site explaining how she actually had 4 entry and 4 exit wounds. One went into her right wrist and exited. That bullet entered her left wrist and exited. And then the second shot, if we assume it was the second shot, entered just above her elbow, exited it, entered her left arm and exited it. So 2 shots actually created 4 entry and 4 exit wounds on her arms, giving the idea that she had her hands braced on the steering wheel when the killer fired the first 2 shots.
Yeah, it's possible. Obviously, she was never able to talk after being shot, but it's possible she was proceeding to try and pull out when she realized something was wrong, and just never, was able to get all the way out of there, and that's why the car was found like it was.
Those 4 entry and exit wounds on her arms is the only way to explain the overall 9 entry wounds and 7 exit wounds, because obviously 2 went through Michael Mageau. They were the ones found in Darlene Ferrin at autopsy. The other three all exited her body that were struck her directly. So, you know, this is why I was considering the state of the vehicle and her autopsy results at the same time may have suggested she was targeted first. But I know most people actually think that Michael Mageau was shot first because of what was said in the debut of Zodiac letter.
Yeah, and it's weird because she was essentially shot across from him, so that the bullets would have had to been flying
exactly
by him to hit her since he was in the passenger seat. Some interesting things came out of this attack. Obviously, Mike Mageau lived, although he was badly hurt. But there were interesting little factoids that came out of this case that some people over the years have found kind of bizarre. When they took Mike Mageau's clothes off at the hospital, he was wearing several sets of clothes, and it was a hot July 4th night. And, you know, he explained later on that it's because he was very thin and he wanted to look bigger than he actually was. But a lot of people thought, he knows something's coming and he's trying to get extra layers of clothes on to protect himself, as if that would stop a bullet. But there's been a little bit of that. And then also, since he survived, he was able to give an account of what happened, which was recounted how they were sitting there and the car pulled up and the guy put a light out and walked up to the car and shined it in there, and then the shooting started. He was able to give a little bit of a description, but it's a very vague and generic description. And I wonder how accurate it is, because you've got a big light shining in your face and someone shooting at you. I just find it hard that you're going to give a very accurate description. And then also, as to the height of the shooter, you know, you're seated down in a car looking up at someone that's standing up outside shooting down. I don't know how he was able to accurately estimate a height, but I think he said 5'8" or thereabouts. You know, later on, not to get too far ahead of things, but the height will come into question later on as far as other things about the description. But the very first description we have here is from Mike Mageau of Zodiac. Of course, he's not officially Zodiac yet. He hasn't called himself that, but the shooter doesn't really gel with later descriptions, which we'll get into when we get into those episodes. And I wonder if it's just in part to him being shot while he's got a light in his face.
Well, I think I don't put too much into his description because, he only saw a side profile. He actually stated that himself. He would have had less than a second, probably less, to actually get a visual on the guy's face. And like you say, he was being shot incessantly. So I don't really put any great significance into his description at all. And we'll probably come to it later, but, you know, I actually think the killer was probably closer to 40. So I don't think the killer was 25, but that's for another day. But I think, like you said, a flashlight in his face. He's not the most reliable witness. And why should he be? He's got a gun aimed at him. He's been shot up to pieces. And he's got a flashlight in his face, and he admitted himself he only saw a side profile. I don't think that's a very good basis for drawing any great conclusions from Michael Mageau's testimony, sadly. But quickly, in terms of his clothing, a lot of people stated that he was actually a burglar who broke into people's houses, and that was one of the tactics used by burglars because they could switch clothing, you know, take a layer of clothing off after they'd robbed somebody's house, so the police couldn't get a description of them. I don't particularly buy that. I actually believed, because I've done it myself when I was younger, very skinny, and I wore several layers of clothing, even in the summer. So I believe that's more likely the truth in that instance.
And a couple other things, too. Some people, there's a documentary called This is the Zodiac Speaking, and it accompanied the Zodiac movie, the DVD release. In that, they interview Mike Mageau. I think the interview was done back in 2007. Obviously, it's decades after the shooting. And he's all over the place with what he claims now in recent years versus what he claimed in police reports right after the shooting. So as far as I am concerned, you can dismiss almost everything he said in that documentary because it was the details changed so much. And to me, I don't want to speak ill of the guy, but he seems like he's suffering from some kind of addiction or illness or something. He's got something going on, and I don't know what it is, but he's suffering from something. So I couldn't put much stock in what he says now. But interesting things that he said at the time of the shooting. It sounded like there were a silencer on the gun. But that's an interesting thing. But, the caretaker's son of the golf course there, can't remember the distance.
800 feet.
Yeah, whatever it was. And he heard the shots from his house. So that doesn't sound like a silencer. Now, to me, I fired a lot of small caliber handguns like 22s and 38s and 9mm, and they don't have an over loud gunshot. The sound, the ones that I've shot of, they have a crack to them, and it's not like firing louder, higher caliber weapons or shotguns that are very loud. So I just wonder if in his mind he said it wasn't that loud, as loud as he might have thought it might be, because they do sometimes sound like cracking as opposed to loud explosions. But we know it was definitely loud enough for the caretaker's son to hear quite a distance away.
Well, I think there's a case to be had that after the first shot was fired close to his head, that would have deafened him temporarily, and any subsequent shots would have felt muted because his ears would have been ringing. And so the rest of the shots could have easily felt like they were coming from a silenced gun.
I mean, and the adrenaline, the shock, whatever, all that combined, he might not have, they might have not sounded like anything at all to him.
But also, if we believe George Bryant, the caretaker's son, he gave a completely different description of the order of the shots that Michael Mageau recalled. If you remember, there was one shot, then there was a pause, then there was a second shot, and then there was a barrage of shots, which is totally different to the version given by Michael Mageau, where the killer fired 5, retreated, came back and fired 4. That's not the description given by George Bryant. So whether George Bryant's mistaking fireworks, bullets, I don't know. The sound of gunshots, well, that's another story. I mean, but you would expect, Michael Mageau, we've said his testimony is not great, so maybe the whole thing unfolded completely different to what was actually told by Michael Mageau, along with his description.
Yeah, it's interesting when you have two different people giving an account of the same incident.
Yes.
There can be differences like this, but it happens because people's memories are different. I think that's been proven. So I think maybe the truth lies somewhere in between both of their accounts. We can sort of get a general idea of what happened when we combine both of their accounts.
Also, what do you think of the take of when the killer leaned into the vehicle, possibly? Because, those two casings found on the back floorboard of the Corvair, suggesting the killer leaned right in to take those final 2 shots at Mageau. What do you think of the idea that possibly the killer, who was described as wearing a shirt and no jacket, possibly got blood on him as he leant in, and hence had to go home first? Maybe he planned to make the phone call originally, immediately after he left the crime scene, before it had been discovered. But when he found blood on him, and he had no jacket possibly, he decided to alter his plans and drive home and walk to the payphone, which I know you have considered quite heavily.
Yeah, that's it. I'm trying to put myself in the killer's shoes and imagine what I would do if I was him. I wouldn't want to be driving around with blood on me. So if I had any blood on me, I'd want to get that off. I wouldn't want to have a gun in the car, because if you get pulled over and you have a gun in the car, whether there's a murder that night or not, questions are going to be asked by police, especially if it's the night of the murder, if he somehow gets pulled over after that. And then the third thing he's got to worry about is there any possible way someone saw my car and can give a description of it? I wouldn't want to take a chance, so I wouldn't want to park that car. So we've got that missing time there, that 40 minutes or whatever it is, and before he called to report the shootings. That's a lot of time to go clean out, put his car away, hide his gun, change his clothes, whatever he's got to do, and then distance himself from all that stuff that can get him in trouble. And then he can go to a phone booth. Again, just speculation by myself. He could walk to a phone booth near his house and make that call and not be connected to the crime in any way as far as physical evidence.
Yeah, I mean, if he left, and the payphone's about 10 minutes away. So if he did live near the payphone, obviously he's got to allow 10 minutes to get to the payphone from his residence. Let's say he lived 10 minutes away. He drives to his residence, changes his clothes, cleans up, as you said, prepares himself, and then travels. He could actually live very close to that payphone, in theory. I mean, if I always thought, what would I do? If I lived in San Francisco and I knew I wanted to make a payphone call bragging about the murders I'd just done, it's common sense that I would drive clean away from that crime scene, 10, 15 miles, make a phone call in Oakland, anywhere, and then drive on to San Francisco. Why hover around the crime scene where you don't live in excess 30 minutes, at least longer than necessary, to make a phone call just next to a police station in your vehicle, covered in blood, holding the smoking gun? It all doesn't quite add up to me, you know?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'd want to get as far away from the crime scene as possible. And you mentioned there's several towns that he could have made that call from that are a lot further away, and putting that distance between himself and the shooting. So that's why I come back to maybe he lives right there. Maybe he switched cars. Maybe he did have a car with him, but he went home and switched cars and drove a different car. I personally wouldn't want to have the car that I just shot someone. Again, I'm trying to put myself in the mind of a killer and think of these things. Maybe he didn't think of things like that. Maybe he was spur of the moment and didn't care and went wherever he went and then drove his car with his gun to the spot and made the call. Who knows? But if he was careful and he wanted to avoid any possibility of being connected, I think he would have taken those precautions to try and distance himself from being identified.
Yeah, that's why I brought up the debut of Zodiac letter, because, you know, he never described any of his victims, any people in great detail, but he went overboard to describe the age of the Negro male, his shabby clothing, how he observed him in his brown car. He must be the only criminal who actually helps the police in confirming his vehicle was brown, which he obviously knew Michael Mageau by that point had told the police the car was possibly brown. I don't know any killer that would confirm that and help the police unless he's actually selling them a lie. And that's why I brought up the phone rang and drew attention to me and my car. It seems really forced to bring up me and my car. Why not just say it drew attention to me? The fact that he's selling this car notion and giving away the colour of it seems to suggest to me he may very well have been on foot. And there's another thing I'd like to bring up in a minute. What is your opinion? You know, they traced the phone call, but you couldn't trace phone calls back then, but they rang the phone back. Because if we believe the Zodiac, the phone rang and it drew attention to him. So we know that they rang back that payphone at Springs in Tuolumne. My question to you is, how long do you think it took them to ring back that phone? I mean, once he hung up the phone, how long would it have taken Nancy Slover to get the operator to then ring back that phone to trace it, sort of thing? As they said, trace, but you know, you couldn't trace phone calls that quickly back then, but they can ring back a phone.
I'd be guessing, and I would say just a matter of seconds, enough that he didn't get out of the phone booth before it rang. If he's being honest, if he's telling the truth, which, you know, in this case, there's instances where we doubt that he is telling the truth, but if he was being truthful and the phone rang immediately, I would think it had to be a matter of seconds, because he hung the phone up and it just started ringing right back. So it didn't take very long. He didn't get very far. He definitely heard it ring back, if he's being honest.
And we know that he must have learned from that, because after his attack in Napa, when he called the police, he left the phone off the receiver so it couldn't ring back.
Yeah, the only reason I brought it up was because if he hung up the phone and was in his vehicle, he would have got back in his vehicle, would have been out of there within 20 seconds. So if they actually this is why would have been great to find out actually how long it took them to ring back that phone. Let's say they'd rang back that phone after a minute, let's say. He would have been long gone in his vehicle. He would never have heard it. The fact he heard it means he was in earshot within it. But if he walked away from the payphone, even maybe 30 seconds, a minute down the road, he would have heard it in the distance ringing. And that's why I would have loved to have found out exact time they rang back that payphone. Because if they said, we rang back the payphone after 1 minute, that would almost certainly tell you that he wasn't in a vehicle, because he would have got in his vehicle, would have been out of earshot almost immediately, but not walking away from the payphone, which is a shame.
It's a very good point. We'll get into more in depth in future episodes as we go back and dissect each of these cases closer. There were people of interest. There were some shady characters on the night of the Blue Rock Springs attack. There was actually an arrest made of a guy. We won't share his name, but he was arrested and he had a gun and he had some shady background, and I think his name actually comes up a couple different times in the reports. Other people that are interesting too that we'll talk about. One guy who's in the reports who's a suspect was painting his car very soon after.
Yes, I've done a piece on that one.
Yeah, there's a guy painting his car very quickly after the murder. So again, lots of details, lots of shady people, things that we'll talk about more in depth as we go back and tear apart these cases a little more.
You covered a piece on somebody called Tony, didn't you, on your site?
Santa Barbara, Tony?
Was it San Jose?
I thought it might have been Santa Barbara. And again,
He reported that somebody had said to him that I've shot 2 people and I need to get out very quickly. Can you give me a lift or something like that? And I remember you covering it on your site. I think the guy was called Tony. I don't know his second name offhand.
Yes.
He would have actually, because you came to the conclusion, he described the color of the car, and you were trying to find out whether it had actually been reported in the newspapers for him to know those details, and actually you found out it was available in the newspapers, so he could have easily made it up. But it seems odd that he would make something like that up and interject himself into the police investigation.
It's interesting in the background that you're talking about. That I'll brush up on that, and we'll touch on that in another episode. But he apparently is, as far as I can remember, had hitched a ride supposedly from Santa Barbara to Vallejo to visit family, and supposedly rode with this killer, or someone he thought was the killer. The Santa Barbara thing in itself is interesting because there's, as we'll find out later on, there's a possible crime down there in Santa Barbara, the Zodiac, that could be tied to Zodiac. So the fact this person with this story was coming from Santa Barbara to visit Vallejo cast a little bit of suspicion on himself, in my opinion. So we'll definitely dig into that a little bit in a future episode and talk more about that too.
Yeah, and the one about the car being painted, that was actually a letter sent into the Vallejo Police Department on that one. Yeah, and he didn't live too far from the payphone either. The guy who was suggested in that letter as a possible suspect, but I mean, it didn't go anywhere. I mean, there's lots of these examples in the police report. But yeah.
There's some local people that were looked at and were reported by other relatives or friends or neighbors because they were odd, because they fit what they thought the profile might be. And it'll be interesting as we talk about some of those people going forward in future episodes. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac. Or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site, zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackillersite.com.
Before we wrap up, I'd like to invite you to listen to this preview of another true crime podcast that's really good, and we think you'll enjoy. It's called Moms and Murder. On behalf of Richard Grinell, this is Mike Morford saying thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us back here for the next all-new episode of Zodiac Speaking.
Chickens, Diet Coke, reality TV, and murder don't seem like things that should go together, but somehow they do. If you're looking for your next binge-worthy podcast and you like your true crime light on the gore, then you should check out our show, Moms and Murder, a true crime podcast hosted by myself, Mandy, and my dear friend, Melissa.
Each week, we give our take on a new crime story, balancing our delivery of facts and levity while still giving the stories the respect they deserve and making you feel like you're a part of the conversation. And there are over 100 episodes to binge. Search Moms and Murder on your favorite podcast app and subscribe so you never miss a new episode.